Welcome in, everybody, to the Flagship podcast. I am Chip Brown of Horns247.com, normally joined by our fearless leader, the managing editor of Horns247, Taylor Estes. She is under the weather. She's been battling meningitis, for crying out loud. So prayers and good wishes to Taylor Estes for a quick recovery. And Taylor and I announced that we were going to be wearing gray for this podcast because it is, it's Brain Tumor Awareness Month, and we are supporting Avery Huffman, the daughter of national recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports, Brandon Huffman, whose daughter Avery fought a 7.5-month battle with the deadly DIPG brain tumor. And so we are in full support of Avery Strong. And if you would like to help, you can certainly make a donation at averystrongdipg.org. Avery Strong. Great, incredible family, the Huffman family, and Avery, a bright light in that family. Okay, kids. So it's been a minute since we have met here on the Flagship podcast. I think I have set off Aggie Nation by mentioning in last week's Insider that I was hearing that the SEC, when Texas and OU join, I'm still hearing 2024, which would be the first year that ESPN has the rights to SEC football. I'm hearing 2024 for Texas and Oklahoma to be a part of the SEC football season. And I'm hearing also that the SEC would break into four-team pods. And you would have games against each of the three teams in your pod, as well as 2 games against teams from 3 of the other pods. That way, you're hosting each team at least once every 4 years, and that would solve a scheduling quirk in the SEC right now that had Georgia and Alabama meeting only twice in the last 13 years. So, getting to a 16-team league, if you break up into the four-team pods, you actually can put some regularity into the scheduling so that, like I said, you're at least hosting every other team in the SEC at least once in a 4-year period, and you're facing them twice, either home or away in that 4-year period. But I'm also hearing that Texas A&M does not want to be in the same pod with Texas, which could make things tricky for those teams to meet on an annual basis. Now, when I reported this, the Aggie insiders came, flying at me and said that A&M definitely wants to play Texas every year. Okay, well then let's see how that works if they're not in the same pod, or maybe they will end up in the same pod. But what I was hearing was a proposal that had Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Missouri in a pod, and Texas A&M and LSU with Ole Miss and Mississippi State, and then Auburn and Alabama in a pod with Tennessee and Vanderbilt, while Georgia and Florida would be in a pod with Kentucky and South Carolina. So obviously there's time before this has to get figured out, but you got to think that these proposals are being hashed over as we speak, as the SEC prepares to become a 16-team super league. And obviously that maneuver almost a year ago now triggered all kinds of reaction across the college athletics landscape, including the Pac 12, the Big Ten, and the ACC forming sort of a voting block on issues having to deal with the Power Five, namely the expansion of the college football playoff. After we had a working group that included SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey and Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowlesby come forward with a proposed 12-team college football playoff, there was excitement that maybe it could get done before 2025. Well, after the announcement that Texas and Oklahoma would be joining the SEC, uh, probably, well, they announced effective the summer of 2025. There was this sort of whoa moment because uh, obviously Bob Bowlesby felt like after working on a group that came up with the 12-team college football playoff that included Greg Sankey, and Greg Sankey was working on that group knowing that his conference was possibly going to add Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. Obviously, an expanded 12-team college football playoff would probably favor the SEC at that point in terms of just having so many top-heavy brands. Certainly, Texas has not carried its weight in the Big 12 the way Oklahoma has in terms of qualifying for the college football playoff. Oklahoma's been somewhat of a regular, while Texas has yet to qualify for a college football playoff and probably needs at least until 2024 to get its own house in order. And certainly Steve Sarkisian and the way that he's handled this offseason following a 5-7 year that included the longest losing streak in Texas football history since 1956, the year before Darrell Royal took over the Longhorns, and 5-7 finish. The offseason for the Longhorns has been phenomenal, and you include the top 5 recruiting class, and obviously the hiring of Gary Patterson, the transfer of Isaiah Nair from Wyoming, the talented receiver who had 12 touchdown catches last year. Also, Ajayi Hall, one of the top receivers in the 2021 recruiting class, although a bit of a traveler at this point, 3 high schools in his senior season, and then Alabama, and for one season, and now Texas. But he was recruited to Alabama by Jeff Banks and Steve Sarkisian. They were part of the team that helped recruit Ajayi Hall, so there's a familiarity there. And I agree with my man Josh Pate, our incredible 24/7 sports college football pundit, in saying that Steve Sarkisian would not bring in a player he didn't feel like would fit into the culture that Steve Sarkisian's trying to build. And it's a rebuild. I mean, it's a complete rebuild. We've written extensively at horns247.com in the Insider about the fact that the Texas roster has been turned over 40% from last year, with the 28 signings in the 2022 class, in addition to 5 transfers. And oh, by the way, as of this moment, Texas is still under consideration by 2021 Bolitnikoff Award winner, Pitt receiver Jordan Addison, who made a visit to Texas before going on to check out USC. And I think Texas is the underdog in this race for sure. Brennan Marion, the new Texas receivers coach, who's also part of that banner offseason for Steve Sarkisian, the hiring of Brennan Marion from Pitt as Texas's new receivers coach, in addition to Tashard Choice from Georgia Tech as Texas's new running backs coach. Two high energy assistant coaches with bright futures, who've certainly helped in the recruiting success that Texas is having in this offseason. Brennan Marion's relationship with Jordan Addison, a big part of the reason that Jordan Addison is considering Texas. So, some interesting photos from Jordan Addison's recruiting visit to Texas, the one that went viral, him praying apparently with Jordan Whittington with a boom box over his shoulder that said "Hook'em Horns," and Quinn Ewers also, who wears number 3, by the way. Jordan Addison was wearing a number 3 jersey in that recruiting photo. But interesting times. It does appear that the Texas players have come together, and I'm going to get to this point that I think Steve Sarkisian made on this this Texas Fight Tour that is happening across the state. It opened in San Antonio on May 9th. Then it went to Dallas and Fort Worth. It concludes in Houston this week, Wednesday, May 18th. And Steve Sarkisian said that if you're going to look at your program, you have to look at it from A to Z. And he said, where I failed, the program was not doing a better job of connecting with my team at this time a year ago. This time a year ago, Texas was sort of scattered all over the north end, with the coaches' offices up on the 7th floor. You had player position meeting groups happening on the 8th floor in the suites of the Darrell K. Royal Texas Memorial Football Stadium. And of course, the football team was bunkering out of the visitors' locker room. That visitors' locker room that Ed Orgeron complained didn't have good enough air conditioning a couple of years ago, because the south end of DKR was being renovated. Of course, that renovation was finished in August. The football team all moved into their new facilities then. But Steve Sarkisian saying that he didn't do a good enough job of making sure that he was connected to his team and that players were connected to each other during this time a year ago. And let's face it, every player on a successful football team says that you build your bond as a team right now, during the offseason, during winter conditioning, during spring football, during summer workouts, during fall camp. And this was a team last year in Texas who got off to a 4-1 start, obviously got ambushed by Arkansas, but started to put it together, went to TCU and won against a team that it had struggled with mightily over the last, since TCU entered the Big 12, and I'm sure Texas fans, the biggest sigh of relief, in being able to bring on Gary Patterson, the former head coach at TCU, as a special assistant, is that they don't have to face Gary Patterson anymore, because Gary Patterson seemed to have a special burr under his saddle for Texas, that his team was more prepared for that game than maybe the week after or the week before on TCU's schedule. And that's a big part of the reason that TCU has had so much success against Texas. Anyway, Texas beat TCU, housed Texas Tech, which went on to reach a bowl game, and had double-digit leads on Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and Baylor, the 3 best teams in the Big 12 last year. And then let those leads slip away, and it got into the team psyche. You had players looking like they were giving questionable effort at times late in those losses as they were falling apart. And I think in talking to team sources, the coaches believe that some of the more "uh-oh, here we go again" mindsets may have walked out the door and entered the transfer portal, and that Texas coaches feel like they've done a good job of holding on to the players they feel are bought in and are looking to turn this thing around, turn Texas football around. And when you look at the transfer portal, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, Terrence Cooks, who transferred out of the program a year ago, is definitely a player that I think Texas wanted to hang on to. And I think they wanted to hang on to Marcus Washington, although Marcus Washington, the receiver, who has been a good special teams player and a good blocker, has been wildly inconsistent when it comes to catching the football. And so, you had an exodus of players entering the transfer portal after meeting with Steve Sarkisian for their one-on-one meetings following spring football, and Steve Sarkisian being very honest with those players about where he sees them fitting into the program. After those players got that news, you saw a parade of 7 players into the transfer portal, including 3 receivers. Calvante Dixon, a guy I liked, but just couldn't seem to grasp all the concepts of the offense in a way that Steve Sarkisian wanted. Obviously, Marcus Washington and Dejon Harrison as well. So you look at that and you say, "Uh-oh," but Texas has a clear top 3 at receiver. When you look at Xavier Worthy, who had 12 touchdown catches last year, broke all the freshman records at Texas. Jordan Whittington, the team's best third down receiver a year ago, and the best over the middle tough catch guy because he's built like a running back, played running back at Cuero High School, and is just a tough-minded football player. And then obviously Isaiah Nair, who came from Wyoming, led the Mountain West with 12 touchdown catches a year ago, 6'3" long, big catch radius. And then you bring in Ajayi Hall, who's also 6'3" long, great speed and huge catch radius. And then you've got Troy O'Meary, who's coming off of 2 straight seasons of knee injuries, who's also 6'3" and long and huge catch radius. So you need some of those young receivers to come on to provide the depth that Steve Sarkisian needs. But Steve Sarkisian said at that Texas Fight Tour stop May 9th in San Antonio that he was looking to bring in a transfer receiver. And then the next day, the word got out that Jordan Addison, the 2021 Biletnikoff Award winner at Pitt, was headed to Texas for an official visit. And so we'll see. Texas also looking at trying to bring in a linebacker in the portal. So Steve Sarkisian has said we'll have 19 kids coming in on May 31st, possibly 21. And I think the possibly 21 would include the possibility of Jordan Addison, as well as the possibility of a linebacker arriving in the portal. So I want to hit on a few little highlights from these Texas Fight Tour stops that the coaches are making. Steve Sarkisian has been at every one of them. And the first stop in San Antonio included Vic Schaefer, the women's basketball coach, who's just so filled with passion and is just such a hoot to listen to. 2 straight Elite Eights in his first 2 years at Texas, and getting the crowd all fired up by saying that he was legit ticked off that they didn't beat Stanford in the Elite Eight because he said our team was good enough to be in the Final Four this year. We weren't good enough to be in the Final Four last year. And Jared Elliott, who is the Mike Krzyzewski of college volleyball, just seems to, rack up Final Four appearances in college volleyball with one national championship. We'll have another loaded team again this year with two-time Big 12 Player of the Year Logan Eggleston leading that pack of All-Americans, as well as some incredible transfers, including Madison Skinner, who played for Kentucky when Kentucky beat Texas for the national championship a couple years ago. So that's been great. The Texas fans appreciate that stuff. But I think it's interesting. You get some interesting questions from the crowd, and so it was a lively crowd in Dallas last week. And right off the bat, Chris Del Conte was asked what's going to happen to the Longhorn Network, and the Longhorn Network is going to disappear when Texas goes to the SEC. There's not going to be an SEC West channel that the Longhorn Network will morph into. Basically, Chris Del Conte, who jokingly called LHN the History Channel. The History Channel. He said there's only so many times you can watch that documentary about the 1969 season. And he got some laughter on that. But he said, this is a quote, basically confirming what I've been saying since that 20-year, $300 million deal was announced in 2011, that ESPN purposely overpaid for that LHN network with Texas to keep Texas anchored in the Big 12 by giving them an unprecedented 20-year, $300 million deal. It was too good for Texas to ever walk away from it. And so it kept them in the Big 12 right up until ESPN got the rights to SEC football beginning in 2024. Imagine that. And Texas is going to have to pay roughly $80 million to leave the Big 12. And it has nothing to do with the media rights in the Big 12 expiring in 2025. Texas signed a grant of rights, a 99-year grant of rights with the Big 12 that stipulates if you are going to leave, you have to forfeit your final 2 years of revenue distribution in the league. And that is estimated at roughly $40 million per year, and a total of $80 million. So no one will admit this publicly, but the money that ESPN still owes Texas for LHN will be $150.5 million at the end of the 23-24 school year. That's almost enough to cover both Texas and Oklahoma, their exit fees from the Big 12 if necessary, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. So a couple other nuggets from the Texas Fight Tour that I thought were interesting. Everyone always wants to know who's the fastest player on the football team. Who's the fastest player on the football team? And so Steve Sarkisian was asked this, and he said, I think we'd have a hell of a race between Xavier Worthy, Keelan Robinson, and Keaton Crawford. He said, adding that they were also bringing in Brennan Thompson, who ended up running like a 10-2 in the 100 at the state track meet last weekend. So Sarkisian said, we could put together a pretty good 4x team for Flo, Texas track coach Edric Florial, with those four players: Xavier Worthy, Keelan Robinson, Keaton Crawford, and Brennan Thompson, the incoming freshman receiver from Spearman. I thought this was funny from Chris Beard. He was asked, who is the best shooter on the Longhorns basketball team? And Beard kind of paused for a second and said, that's an issue right now. And that drew laughs. He said, we will have some guys who could shoot the basketball. And he said that's one of the things they're really working on to improve. But he said that the recruiting class coming in this fall, which includes Arterio Morris and Rowan Brumbaugh, he said those two can shoot the basketball, and he said that Marcus Carr and Timmy Allen will both shoot threes for Texas this upcoming season. And that led to a question about Marcus Carr. And um, Beard suggested that because Texas had to ask Marcus Carr to do so much last year, running the point, be a distributor, score the basketball, play defense, that with some more help around Marcus Carr, they might get the best version of Marcus Carr. And I'll tell you, from the sources I spoke to, I think the coaching staff was surprised that Marcus Carr decided to come back for another year. That Marcus Carr had never been coached as hard as he had been by Chris Beard and this staff, and but I think the connection that he formed with Timmy Allen, and I think Timmy Allen, the way that Timmy Allen finished the year was not the way he wanted to finish it. He probably had his worst game in the NCAA tournament against Purdue, where he had more fouls, 5, than points and rebounds combined. And so, they're still of the belief that they can compete for a championship under Chris Beard with Christian Bishop coming back. You've got, Brock Cunningham coming back. Dylan Dezue, the 6'9" forward, is in the NBA draft without an agent, but I think there's a really strong possibility that he will return. And so when you factor in those players returning, in addition to Arterio Morris, Rowan Brumbaugh, and then the Jabari Rice, the transfer from New Mexico State, who played with Timmy Allen's brother, Teddy Allen, at New Mexico State, and they were an NCAA tournament team last year. They feel like they have a team that can reload. And so interesting that Chris Beard said, who's our best shooter? That would be an issue right now. And then a couple other nuggets from the Texas Fight Tour that I thought were interesting. Steve Sarkisian was asked, are you going to have to sort of scale back your offense if you end up with one or more true freshmen starting on the offensive line? And Steve Sarkisian basically said, yeah, it's a possibility. He said, we'd love to have every scheme we can run under the sun, because I'm a true believer in the more things we do really well, the harder we are to defend. But I can't do that in sacrificing a player knowing what to do or how to do it really well. So maybe we don't have all of our schemes if that means getting our best players on the field to go out and perform. And I think that's honestly a positive sign, because I felt like last year in the quest to be able to do so many different things, the offensive line at times just seemed overburdened and made pre-snap penalties that really hurt Texas, especially in the second half of those games against OU, Oklahoma State, Baylor, and that stuff just has to get cleaned up. And you've got Junior Angalau, Jake Majors as returning starters on that offensive line. Also Christian Jones. We'll see if Christian Jones can hang on to that right tackle spot. And we'll see where Hayden Connor factors into this, as well as early enrollee freshman Cole Hudson, who had an impressive spring. But impressive spring is one thing. Going up against Alabama in week 2 is another thing. And that's why I would also suggest making sure that if you missed our Flagship podcast interviews with Fozzie Whitaker and Michael Griffin the last 2 weeks, that you check those out, because I think it's a sobering conversation, going position by position, looking at what Texas has coming back in terms of experience and in terms of production. And experience doesn't always equal production. And unfortunately, experience definitely does not equal production on the Texas defense. And Michael Griffin does a really good job, I think, of laying that out. And you can hear the disappointment in his voice almost, as he talks about the fact that Texas has had to move guys from other positions to the safety position. Last year, when Brendan Schooler was moved from receiver to safety and immediately became a starter, Michael Griffin thought that was preposterous. How could that happen? He recalled his time at Texas, which included that 2005 national championship season, and how he had to, wait his turn. And then, you had guys like Aaron Ross and Terrell Brown who were rotating, and Terrell Brown wasn't even a regular starter, but went on to a 10-year career in the NFL. I mean, the talent was backlogged or backloaded or just backed up on a runway back then. And now Texas is scrambling to try to find players who can start at field safety and boundary safety for the 2022 season. And while Steve Sarkisian put a good spin on it, he said, look, we got guys now with Keaton Crawford, who he mentioned is one of the fastest guys on the team, Anthony Cook. Of course, you've got Jaron Thompson still in that safety room, but you've also moved Jahdae Barron from corner to nickel corner, as well as Mo Blackwell from linebacker to safety. Mo Blackwell, a guy I'm really intrigued by and think has an incredibly bright future. And maybe this all pays off in a big way. But Steve Sarkisian saying that he feels like one of the benefits of these moves is that he'll have more players who can play man-to-man defense, even if they've got to come up, into the slot as a safety and play some press coverage, because this is the defensive philosophical shift that has happened in this offseason that Steve Sarkisian has mentioned in these Texas Fight tour stops, that they are hell-bent right now to be able to play more man coverage, be able to play physical at the line of scrimmage, so that they can bring an extra player into the box to help stop the run. As we know, Texas was a failure at stopping the run last year, gave up more than 200 yards rushing per game, more than 5.2 yards per carry. And just, everyone's like, oh, there was no pass rush. There's no pass rush. Texas had no pass rush. Well, no one was passing. They were all running the ball because they didn't need to pass. That was the unfortunate thing about Oklahoma State coming back. Oklahoma with Caleb Williams, the first time, getting on the field for the first time as a true freshman, being able to run all over the place, including that 66-yard touchdown run on 4th and 1 that sort of flipped the momentum of the entire Red River shootout from Texas being up 28-7 to ultimately losing that game. Spencer Sanders didn't have to make big throws for Oklahoma State because Oklahoma State was able to run it late against Texas. And same thing, Baylor, Jerry Bohannon turned the ball over, but Baylor was able to run the ball late and hang on for that 31-24 win. That was a game Texas absolutely should have won, but the weird fake punt snafu on 4th and 11, did Sarkisian, indicate to Cameron Dicker that he could go for it, or really leave that call up to Dicker, or, that's just, you can't do that. You can't leave that call up to a player. You got to tell the player, hey, we're punting the ball here, because Texas was in a one possession game, didn't need to take that big of a gamble. But nonetheless, Texas has got to stop the run this year, or it doesn't matter what the pass rush is doing. But Texas, the philosophical shift on defense, and when Steve Sarkisian has been talking about that defensive philosophy change, he has mentioned Gary Patterson. So Gary Patterson, of course, special assistant to Steve Sarkisian, and Sark saying that that was a great pickup. So there we have it, kids, for this week's flagship podcast. And again, wearing gray today in support of Avery Huffman, her battle with the DIPG brain tumor. It's Brain Tumor Awareness Month, and if you'd love to help our man, our man Brandon Huffman, the national recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports, it was his daughter Avery who, fought valiantly for 7.5 months against that deadly DIPG brain tumor. You can make a donation at averystrongdipg.org. And to our colleague at Horns 24/7, Taylor Estes, battling meningitis, God bless her, and let's get her back with a safe and healthy recovery. And we'll be back on the Flagship podcast, baby. It is the off season, but football season never ends here on the Flagship. So until next time, thanks for listening. I'm Chip Brown. We'll see you over at horns247.com. And until next time, stay safe and keep the faith.